Virtual participation by Mr. Duncan.
Absolutely, thank you.
All right, so for roll call, Ms. Connolly. Ms. Connolly, by that close mic, can you grab it? Just say here.
Here.
Mr. Duncan remotely.
Yes, here.
Ms. Hardy.
Here.
Ms. Sean Siscott.
Here.
Mr. Lickenhouse.
Here.
Mr. Snyder.
Here.
And Mayor Tarter.
Here.
Thank you. And now we do need to authorize electronic participation by Mr. Duncan. And prior to that, I want to, for the record, to notify the public that Mr. Duncan did inform the mayor of the need for virtual participation. And if I could ask Mr. Duncan to specify his physical location.
Yes, I'm coming to you from lovely West Knoxville, Tennessee, where I'm with my father, tending to various matters related to his medical situations.
I'd request if you could have a motion to approve the electronic participation, and there is a motion written at your dais. So,
All right, well, I will entertain such a motion.
Thanks, Mr. Mayor. I move that the City Council approve electronic participation by Phil Duncan in tonight's meeting for personal reasons pursuant to the City Council's policy on participation in meetings through electronic means as adopted by City Council Resolution 2021-19.
Second.
All right, we have a motion and a second. All in favor? Aye.
Aye.
Opposed?
Aye.
Abstentions? The ayes have it. Thank you very much, and we appreciate your efforts to join us. Mr. Duncan, we know that's difficult sometimes to do this remotely, but thank you very much for taking the effort. I look forward
Thank you all.
look forward to your participation tonight. So now that we've got that out of the way, I think we're probably ready to go ahead and get started with our actual work session. So I'm going to ask you, Mr. Shields, to maybe lead the staff report as to the naming of the streets in West Falls Church project.
Thank you, Mayor Tarter. And so this item is the West Falls Church Economic Development Project street naming resolution. And what the request tonight is for your input on these street names for the West Falls development. And specifically, after getting that input, then the decision tonight is to whether or not to schedule this for a formal referral out to boards and commissions at your meeting on October 25th, 2021. We're joined by Carly Aubrey, who's our staff lead for this project, and she will give a staff report. And we're also joined by Falls Church Gateway Partners, and Matthew Stainhook is on the call as well, and he'll give us some background information on these proposed names. Ms. Aubrey.
Thank you, Council. Thank you, Mr. Shields. So Council is requested to consider and provide input on the proposed street names for the West Falls Economic Development Project. And this is a new mixed-use district adjacent to the city's new high school and near the West Falls Church Metro Station. It will be constructed by FCGP Development and will include several buildings, a walkable grid of streets, and a central open space. And uses will include office, hotel, condominiums, apartments, senior housing, retail, civic use, and a grocer. Given the significance of the site, and because there are 5 proposed street names, the recommended criteria and procedure for naming the streets within the development is City Code Section 2-210, naming a public property or facility. And this code requires that the naming be done by council resolution. Council must hold a public hearing and seek recommendation from the Planning Commission, Historic Commission, Recreation and Parks Advisory Board, and any other boards or commissions that council deems appropriate. FCGP Development has provided a map, which is included at the end of the report as part of the resolution. And they also provided a narrative for the benefits and reasoning behind the proposed names, which is also included in the staff report. There is a table in the staff report that list the temporary street names that were included on the special exception site plan and what the proposed street names are to be. And that's shown right now on the screen. Commons Drive, proposed name is West Falls Drive. Streets A and B is recommended for Magnolia Street. Alley 1, Mulberry Lane. Lane 2, Cardinal Lane. And lanes 3 and 4, Arbor Way. An initial staff concern was the similarity of the West Falls Drive name to other streets in the city with the word falls in it. One recommendation was to name the northwest streets after trees. For example, Magnolia Street in place of Commons Drive. Another preferred recommendation that's been discussed since the posting of the staff report is West Falls Boulevard. Boulevard better denotes the type of street that what is now Commons Drive will be, with a divided central open space in the middle, multimodal aspects of it. And it will also help differentiate it from the other Falls streets, and will capture the site name as well as how it leads to the West Falls Church Metro Station. In conclusion, staff recommends that Council provide input on the street names proposed by FCGP and schedule the item for referral at its October 25th regular meeting with the anticipated final action date of December 13th. And with that, unless there's questions from staff, I can now turn it over to Mr. Steenhoek to talk about and ask or answer any questions about the reasoning behind the street names.
So, okay, so it sounds like you're turning it over to us for questions and comments. And so let's go with that. Do folks have any thoughts? Looks like Ms. Hiscott?
Hear from that guy?
Oh, I mean, didn't we already, I'm not sure, you're trying to tell us why it should be named after streets and birds and trees?
We will first just, if you had any questions of staff, but I think it would be worthwhile to hear from Mr. Steenhoek with the developer and kind of get their context for the naming. They did go through quite a process to arrive at these names, and let's hear from him and then see if there are questions.
Sure, all right, that's fine. Welcome.
Welcome. Thank you for having me. I appreciate everyone's time today to talk about this. As Mr. Shields mentioned, we have run a fairly significant internal process trying to identify the important names and approach that we'll be taking or recommending for the project. One of the key things that we wanted to do, well, there were two main goals. One was to incorporate the project seamlessly into the city, and we looked at sort of the approach that's used elsewhere throughout the city and the use of common tree names as a clue for how we should approach this. The second was to try to find a name that would help to brand the collection of developments between this project, Virginia Tech, and the eventual redevelopment at the WMATA station. That being the name for the spine street that connects through, which was earlier mentioned as potentially West Falls Boulevard. We reviewed, to the best of our ability, all the trees that were already used in around the city, looking at the street maps and other resources, and then also looked at what are the native trees in Virginia. And we also wanted to celebrate that the Tree City USA designation. So between those three, we ended with Mulberry Lane, Magnolia Street, and Arbor Way. And then we also looked to the State Bird of Virginia as an opportunity to reference something meaningful for the state, and that being Cardinal Lane. So those are really the main elements that we referenced when determining our recommendations here. And I think the one that is really sort of paramount importance to us is the West Falls Boulevard type name because of its importance for placemaking and really establishing those three areas as a cohesive, defined space. And happy to answer any questions or receive your feedback. Thank you.
Thank you so much. All right, let's go on and go to questions and feedbacks. Ms. Hiscott?
Thank you. I would definitely like residents' feedback on West Falls Drive or Boulevard versus West Street and Falls, Great Falls, Little Falls, if that's too confusing. Having lived in Charlotte, North Carolina, where Queens runs into Queens, runs into Queens, and spending time in Atlanta when every street's named Peachtree, I know that there's confusion there. So I'd actually really like some residents' feedback too on the West Falls Drive and how confusing that may or may not be, or if it is identifiable because it ends in West Falls Church Metro. So I really I look forward to hearing from people in the community what they think.
All right, thank you. Other comments? Mr. Lichtenhouse?
Yeah, I wanted to find an issue with these names, but after looking at them, I like all of them, and I appreciate the thoughtfulness that was put into the names. What is the overall name of the project again?
West Falls.
Okay, somewhat of a rhetorical question. I have to agree from a placemaking perspective. I think that it would be a huge missed opportunity for us not to include the name of the development in the most prominent promenade running through the project. I had initially thought West Falls Commons, but West Falls Boulevard makes a whole lot of sense. And naming it anything else, frankly, especially given that promenade that's going to split the property, connect with Virginia Tech, and eventually run to Metro, I think it needs that placemaking aspect. And I like the choice of the other names, Cardinal, Mulberry. I think that they're all Arbor Way. I think that they're all just a really nice nod to what's important to the city. So I support all of these, and I would support West Falls Boulevard. And I do understand that it can be confusing with all the falls that we have in various names, but it's just an unfortunate byproduct of living in a place called Falls Church. And so we're going to have those. So I support this. I think these are great choices, and I appreciate you guys bringing those to us tonight.
All right, other comments? Mr. Snyder?
Sure. My question about this action is, does it preclude further community input? We have a very creative community, and while I may have certain reactions to these names, I want to make sure that if members of our community come up with better names, that we have the opportunity to consider those before final decision. So that's a question. What are we acting on or considering tonight? Are these exclusive? Or are we putting them out for community exposure and discussion with the possibility that other names may be proposed that we actually might like better? Question.
So I think the latter, but let me ask both Ms. Albury and Mr. Steenhoek how you all view the process going forward to respond to Mr. Snyder's question.
I'll start first. The plan today, according to code, was to go to Planning Commission, a work session, and an action hearing, and then also the Historical Commission and Rec and Parks. I have been talking with Dr. Noonan about the school board. He is still trying to determine if they want to take it at a public meeting of theirs. I'm waiting to hear on that. So that will provide some public exposure. There will be noticing required for the Planning Commission meeting. I can talk with OCOM about possibly getting it on the website, maybe doing an email blast with those that are signed up to receive, not an email blast, like the noticing news flash things that they do for people already signed up to the West Falls webpage. So that while I'm getting those questions and thinking, that's kind of what I've been thinking about, but I can explore more options also.
Actually, I'm fine with that, and I assume the Planning Commission would discuss it in public, and I see that there's another public hearing. My question is, when it's sent out to the public, are we excluding the possibility that there might be other names proposed? While this may be recommended, are we clear that it does not necessarily preempt other names being proposed?
We can make that clear in future staff reports.
Appreciate that. Living on Great Falls Street, I assume that our Great Falls Street is greater than the West Falls Boulevard.
But not as good as Little Falls.
Yeah. Okay, so we're going to
Tiny.
get this thing with, yeah. So we already have Falls competition. Anyway, the second thing is I hope we don't go down some of these bird names, as important as they are in nature, I'm not sure I want to live on red-bellied woodpecker street if I were living there. So anyway, but I'm fine with this to go out to the community as is, but I don't want to preclude someone coming up with some really creative ideas that might relate to science or some other branding that we'd like up there. So if that can be done, I'm fine certainly moving forward with this for discussion purposes.
Okay, any other comments? Vice Mayor Connolly?
I like all these names too. I like the direction you're going in. I think it makes sense and it fits in well with the city. So here's my one wordy thing, and take it for what it's worth. But you have two names that have 3 syllables that start with an M. And I'm just wondering if that gets confusing in people's minds or not. So that's my one thing, but I like all those names. Thank you.
All right. So I have a couple comments if no one else has any. One, I would agree with using a place name here. In other words, West Falls Church something. I just, like Cardinal Way or whatever, just doesn't connote that. You've got both your project and a metro station that really people need to know where it is just without having to think about it or figure it out. And so if we could find a way to have West Falls Church as kind of the spine road, I think that would be good. And I understand there's confusion and maybe there's some, instead of calling it a street or whatever, maybe something unusual so that it sticks in people's minds that it's different. But I think it is important to have placemaking and branding in all ways that you can. Secondly, if there's a way to have something called Meridian that leads to the high school, I think that would be good for the same reason, for placemaking for the high school. And I don't know if there's the alleyway that goes to the high school or something like that could have that name, but that's something I think in the same vein of having placemaking for the project and for the metro station, having placemaking for the high school. And then I guess lastly, I would say we need to coordinate with Fairfax County. They obviously have their own ability to approve names. And so I presume you've already done that. But I think that's important as well to make sure they're on board with whatever we might be leaning towards. So I think that's all I've got. From the developer side, did you have anything you wanted to say back to us, or is that good feedback for you all?
No, it's great feedback. And we have a saying that the best idea wins. So if there's other names that come through that make more sense, then that's great. And I appreciate everyone's support and your appreciation of our effort to come up with these names. So thank you very much.
Let's move on to the next item then, Mr. Shields. I think we have a series of financial matters and budget matters that I presume Ms. Bobble is going to speak to.
We do, and thank you, Mayor Tarter, members of council. The next 2 items are finance related, and we will start with a year-end financial report. So the results of our operations for FY21, which ended on June 30th, 2021. And then from there, we will transition into an update to council on our the current concepts and thinking for the investments using the ARPA allocation to the city. So we'll start with the year-end financial report, and I'll just say a few words of introduction on it. Ms. Bobble will give us a very detailed presentation, as we do each year. This is a really important time to check in on the city's finances and on our economy. Our last time we really looked hard at our tax revenues was when the budget was being developed, and now we have kind of the latest chunk of good hard data so we can see how our local economy is recovering from the pandemic. And a couple of things I'll say just by way of introduction. What Ms. Bobble will present tonight, which was presented on Friday morning to the Budget and Finance Committee, but what she will present tonight will show a result of operations with a positive result at the end of the year. And that is both on the revenue side, and that's a very good sign for our businesses and how they're recovering. However, we'll also note, and there's a very important slide in this presentation that shows our revenues are still 5%, almost 5% below the budget that we presented 2 years ago, and are essentially still down. We have not fully recovered from the pandemic. But there are sectors of our local economy that are doing well, and those are reflected in our results. Other sectors of our economy are still significantly struggling, and so that is an important part of tonight's presentation. And then the other element of the year-end surplus is underspending, and the key element of that is our difficulty and our, despite Herculean efforts to fill vacancies in the city. And this is something that I think everybody is reading about. It's a national challenge and it's a statewide challenge. We had a hiring freeze in effect for a significant part of 2021. We have since lifted that hiring freeze, but we are still today at the same staffing level as we were at the very end of that hiring freeze. So we have made some key we have filled some key vacancies, but we've also had other staff that have left us. And so we're still at that 15 to 20% of our workforce positions unfilled. That's 1 out of every 6 to 1 out of every 5 positions that the council has approved to deliver programs and services and projects is unfilled. So that's significant. That represents a big challenge for us. We're not alone in that challenge, but we're certainly experiencing it here. So with those introductory comments, let me turn it over to Ms. Bawa, who will provide this report, and we look forward to questions or comments and discussion after the year end, and then we'll then transition into the ARPA discussion. Ms. Bawa.
Good evening, Mayor Tarter, members of the council. We have for you the fiscal year 2021 revenues and expenditures. These are preliminary results and unaudited and subject to change, hopefully minor. And the audit report will be brought to council in early December by our auditors. So we will cover today, as shown on slide 2, the fiscal year 2021 revenues and expenditures, and along with that, its impact on the fiscal year 22 projections that were set by council as part of the adopted budget in April, along with a closer look at the year-end fund balances, followed by the next steps that for the schedule that we anticipate. Slide 3, the table has 2 sections, top section and a bottom section. So this chart in the top section shows the overall summary of how the revenues, the general fund revenues, came in above budget by 1.67 million, or 1.6% off the budget. And the lower section table shows the total expenditures, which came in 1.48 or 1.49 million below the budget target, which is 1.4% of the total budget, together resulting in a total year-end balance of 3,153,000. The net negative, I would just like to draw your attention to the net negative of 7.8 million, the amounts that are reflected in the very last line. So that shows the planned use of fund balance for debt service, the West Falls Church Development Project, building safety inspections, the funding that was drawn from the permit reserves, and encumbrances from previous years. So the budget number shows what was planned, the actual shows what would be required, and the difference is the net increase that we see due to higher 1.6% higher revenues than projected and 1.4% expenditures less of the projection. Moving along to slide number 4. This chart shows general fund year-end performance for last 12 years. Most years we have ended with savings, except if you'll see the window between fiscal year 8 and 10, that was the last major economic downturn. Fiscal year, the red portion is the general government portion, the operating expenditures. The green is the schools transfers, The purple on top is the debt service, and the blue line is the operating revenues. One point that I would like to call your attention to is the fiscal year 2021, which is the far right column. The debt service is significantly increased, and that was according to the CIP plan that we had with all the major projects that we took on, particularly the high school, city hall, and the library. So that purple box, the increase, shows the increase in debt service with the bonds that were the big chunk that was issued in November of 2020. In addition, the revenue, operating revenues and expenditures. So if we take the CIP, the transfer to CIP out for the general government, the expenditures are slightly above the revenues, and that's what we saw in the slide before in the net negative piece. That was the planned use of the fund balance for debt service as well as the West Falls Church project. Slide number 5 provides a summary of the general fund unassigned fund balance over a 15-year window. The green and the red lines show the floor and the target of the current fiscal fund balance policy thresholds that we have in place. The 12% is the floor and 17% is the target. The net year-end balance of $3,153,000 for fiscal year 21 brings the unassigned fund balance to $20.5 million, which is a little short of 19%, 18.9% to be exact, which is above the policy target. And if not appropriated, that's where the fund balance will end. And the next steps will show that we have some needs, the one-time needs, and some of this funds would be required to carry forward to address those, and that's coming along in the next few slides. Slide number 6 shows city's capital reserve projections over a 9-year time frame. And these are a lot of numbers, so I'll go a little slowly. As you will note, this is in line with the CIP model, the funding model that was done in advance of issuing bonds for the major capital projects in the last few years. So the intent was to build a fund balance in the first few years. And you will notice that in the additions column, the numbers are bigger in fiscal year 18, 19, 20, bringing the ending fund balance at the end of fiscal year 20 to almost 17 million. And this was done, just to refresh everybody's memory, this was done by dedicated increase to real estate tax and also diverting savings from operating budget, I think 2.5 cents at that, to absorb the increased debt service. And with the intent to draw down funds from this reserve to address the increases in the future years. So if you hover around the drawdowns column, starting in fiscal year 21 onwards, the numbers are top of 5 million. So 21 is 6.46 million the following year and 4.4. So that was the intent, that we build this reserve so that we can draw it down in the future and keep the ending balance steady. The additions column in fiscal year 22 onwards reflects the funding that is expected from the ground lease payments, along with the projected tax yields from the West Falls Church development project. So at the end of fiscal year 2021, the capital reserve ending balance is $10,394,000. Next few slides, we will look at focus more on the general fund revenues and then on the expenditures. So this chart shows a comparison of general fund revenues to last year's actuals and also pre-COVID levels, as Mr. Shields mentioned. The section in the middle, again, lots of numbers, so I'll go a little slow. The section in the middle is operating revenues. If we take out the federal grants and bond proceeds out of that, the fiscal year 2021 actual is $91,987,000. And fiscal year, comparing that to the actual of the year before, fiscal year 2020, it is 305,000 short, which is less than 0.5% shy of fiscal year 2020 actuals. And then the lower portion shows that the operating revenues, the same amount without the federal grants and bond proceeds. If we compare it to the pre-COVID budget that was presented in March of 2020, prior to COVID, this is 4 million short of that budget and no extra growth built into it. This is comparing with the March 9th budget from 2020, which is 4.2% behind those revenue projections at that time. The next few slides provide information on each of the 5 economic indicators that make up approximately 25% of the city's revenues. They do provide very good indication on how the city should expect, so we always take a closer look at these. The red line shows the actual revenues and the blue line shows the budget, and this chart goes over a 10-year time frame. Fiscal year 2021, so in the box, the top line shows the fiscal year 2021 and its comparison with how we did it, how we performed compared to last fiscal year. So personal property taxes came in 1.4% over what was projected, what was collected in fiscal year 2020. And then shifting gear and comparing it to the next year's budget, which is the 2022 budget, that's the green line, which shows that if we were to sustain this trend of the personal property collections, we are in a good position to meet our target for fiscal year 2022. And also provided in the box are the 3-year, 5-year, and 10-year averages. And just to point out that the impact of the pandemic, particularly on the 3-year averages, there are going to be a lot of negatives that we're going to see in many of these revenue categories. Moving along, sales tax. Sales tax was strong in fiscal year 2021, particularly due to the increased grocery sales and online purchases. And it was 8% over fiscal year 20 actual, which was pretty strong. And compared to fiscal year 22 target, we did see that in the last quarter of the fiscal year 20 budget when we were developing the 22 budget, when we saw the fiscal year 20 actual, which had the last quarter, which was affected by pandemic. We did notice that sales tax had started becoming strong. So this was one projection that was not super reduced. And if we sustain these levels, we need to come in at another 1.5% of our fiscal year 21 collections to meet our target for 22. So, which is positions as well for our meeting the target. The next one is meals tax in the same manner. Meals tax in fiscal year 21 is over fiscal year 20 by 3.8%. And if the levels sustain, this was one category where the estimates, the budget estimates for 22 were significantly lower. This is a category that went to almost 35% of collections. Meals tax that came in compared to pre-COVID levels. As of the last quarter, we have recovered to almost 90%, 94% of pre-COVID levels, which is definitely headed in the right direction, and positions us well to meet our, at this rate, positions us well to meet our fiscal year 22 projections. Slide number 11 is for business license taxes, which came in at 3.8% over last year's, the year before, fiscal year 20. And this actual amount is actually more than what we are projecting for 22. And this was fiscal year 21 was high due to exceptionally high due to contract services, increased construction activity, and some professional services that saw some increases. if the levels are sustained again, we should be in a good place to meet our fiscal year 22 targets. Other taxes. So excess over budget in this one was mainly due to recordation taxes. And this is the category where the hotel tax, that transient occupancy tax falls, and which is still lagging behind the budget. And as of the last quarter of 21 is still only at 40% of normal level. This other taxes include cigarette taxes, consumer utility tax, bank taxes, recordation, communication. So it's along with the hotel tax, it's a multitude of taxes that are the remaining other tax revenues that fall in this category. But I did want to call out on the hotel tax. So slide number 13, this chart shows a closer look at the 5 tax revenues that we just saw, one each slide. So these 5 revenue indicators collectively shows the economic activity and represents, again, the same 25% of the city. So in overall, these taxes, as we saw, some of them have performed better than some of the others. If the levels continue as the level of the fiscal year 21 actuals, we are at a place that we should meet our fiscal year 22 budget targets. And I will move along. Next couple of slides are comparison of our expenditures. So this chart, slide number 14, shows the general government expenditures over a 10-year time frame. Fiscal year 22 is a budget figure, which is the far right bar, and the rest of all the bars are actuals figures. The red portion is the general government operations. The green and purple are the interjurisdictional agreements, including WMATA. So overall, in expenditures in fiscal year 21, they are below the orange piece. If you see, the red piece is in 21 is below the fiscal year 20 level. And as the city manager pointed out, it's primarily due to savings from vacancies and staff turnover. And the green portion is the interjurisdictional contracts, which is kind of holding steady for the last few years. We've seen some ups and downs in those. And the blue line shows the personnel costs, which have remained mostly flat, if you will notice, from fiscal year 26 onwards. And looking at it closely in the next chart, chart number 15, which provides the breakdown of the personnel costs. It's the red portion is the retirement contribution of the city, and starting in 2017, we started seeing some decreases. So those savings from the contribution to our retirement has actually helped address and offset the increases, the personnel costs, the compensation increases, and other increases in personnel costs over the years. Again, fiscal year 22 bar is budget, and all the other bars are actuals. Moving to slide number 16, this we provide almost every year to see the averages, prior year averages, 3, 5, and 10 years for school transfers. And for seat enrollment, the student enrollment at the schools. The third row is for the general government. And again, for all of these, I mean, you will see the negatives for the 3-year averages. The next row is the revenue growth, organic revenue growth, which is net of any tax increases, and in comparison with the population growth, which is based on the U.S. Census and Weldon Cooper data through July 1 of 2020, just for comparison. As mentioned earlier, there are some potential uses of these one-time funds, the year-end balance. And these will be brought to council as part of the next budget amendment. The revenues came in over budget by 1.67 million, which makes the school's revenue share portion of 834,000. The other requests include an increase in employee compensation for one-time use would be 350,000. There are some equipment purchases that are required for leaf blowers and some other for DPW and IT equipment for 700,000. And also recently we had a budget amendment where we used capital reserves for purchase of the Virginia Village property, and 1.9 million was allocated towards that. So a portion of these year-end balance, staff would recommend should be held in the capital reserve until we see the first payment of the next payment of the lease, the ground lease, and as well as a plan to replace, pay for the Virginia Village properties and any other one-time needs that are not going to be funded by ARPA. So that, and those all will be brought as part of the next budget amendment to council. I will stop there before we move to the next topic on the ARPA update, unless you want to do questions now or hear everything out and then open it up to questions.
All right, do we have a preference? You guys want to hear the rest of the... I think we should talk about that first. All right. Okay, let's do that then. All right, let's go ahead and open it up to questions and comments on what you presented. Mr. Duncan has his hand up, so let's start with Phil. Phil?
Thank you. Thank you very much. Can you hear me okay? Great. All right. Thanks. Thanks for the presentation, Kieran. So first I want to thank Vice Mayor Conley for allowing me to participate in Friday's Budget and Finance meeting. It was a very good meeting, helpful, interesting. And the things I said in that meeting, I'll try to repeat at more brief form tonight. So the way I look at the numbers that Ms. Ba was presented is that we have a surplus of about $4.1 million. 3.15 comes from a combination of, as she said, revenue excess and underspending. The school side, they finished about $900K to the good. So the combination of those amounts to about $4.1 million. So what I am interested in having a discussion about as we aim towards this vote on the budget amendment is a division of those monies into three buckets to address two things. One, our obvious desire to hire people and do things that we were not able to accomplish during the pandemic because mostly of difficulty hiring people, but also some conservatism because during the depths of the pandemic, we were, kind of skittish about spending money on things. So for both the city and schools, a three-way split would amount to $1.37 million for the city and $1.37 million for the schools to use as they see fit. And the third bucket would be tax rate reduction of 3 cents. I think Ms. Bawa said we throw off about $460,000 per penny. So 3 cents would be about $1.37 million that we would allocate to property tax rate relief in the budget amendment that we would be voting on. I'm not deeply committed to how and what form that tax rate relief takes, whether it's a rebate or a credit or a promise to do something at some date when people feel comfortable doing it. But I feel it sends an important signal and is just a good thing if everybody shares in the situation that we find ourselves in, which is, by and large, a good situation. And so I just want to close with thanks to everybody who worked so hard on the budget last spring. It's great to have a revenue surplus. It's not quite so great to have underspending, but, we tried. We created programs in the budget and hope that people would be able to be hired to fill them, and that didn't always happen. But by and large, it's a good news budget situation for the city and the schools. And I would like to learn more about folks' ideas about whether we could provide some property tax rate relief to continue the ball that we got rolling last spring, which I think now we can see in retrospect was a good direction in which to go, because we ended up giving tax rate relief and it did not in any way damage our budget situation. Okay, I think that's all I have for right now. Thanks.
For folks with comments or questions, Ms. Hardy?
Thank you. Can I just rewind before we talk about what to do with the money? I want to make sure I've understood the picture. On slide 7. So basically, I understand the situation is that we have a $3.1 million surplus, with 1.6 of it due to revenues being better than expected, 1.4, 1.5 being underspending. Is that correct? Karen?
Yes, that's correct.
Okay, and then I heard Phil say the schools have a surplus of $900,000. Is that a slide that I missed, or do you have more details on that, please?
That was presented at the Budget and Finance Committee. They provided their year-end results. Normally, they bring those to council at the joint meeting, which is end of November or early December. So,
As well, is that correct?
that's right.
Do we know how that reserve is looking?
The way it was discussed, it is at 3.4, and adding the expenditures that came in and the net impact of this year, adding a 1.3 would go to roughly 4.7 million. Although they have some funds that they need to encumber for some fencing for their basketball fields and some scoreboards and some athletic uniforms. So I think about $500,000 that they have in encumbrances that need to account for. So.
Okay, well, that's helpful, just additional context. So from slide 7, the way I understood it is, I think you're trying to temper our expectations with how revenues are looking. So even though we've lots of numbers to look at, what I'm seeing on slide 7 is that where FY21 actuals ended up is pretty much flat from FY20 actuals, and we're still about 4.2% below what a pre-COVID situation would have been. Is that correct?
That's correct.
But the good news story that I saw on slide 13, which shows kind of where we are actuals versus where we need to be, is we're already ahead 7.5%. So even if we don't do anything else and we just maintain how we did this year, we will be ahead of next year's revenues by 7.5%. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's correct. That's in comparison to the budget that we set.
That's even outside of residential property, which obviously is the biggest chunk of our revenues.
These revenues, and they're only 25% of our revenues.
Okay.
So it's positive. It's certainly good news,
Yep.
but it's not to be seen that we're 7.5% ahead of for the entire city budget. It's just those.
Just these local
selected
revenues
local
are.
tax and stuff.
Yep. Okay.
If I may, sorry, the other big ones that are affected by COVID are the charges for services for athletic programs, and also fines, parking fines and driving violations and things. So we've seen a drop in investment revenues. So we've seen a drop in some of the other revenue categories, which are non-tax.
So as tempting as it is, I think, to go and deploy 3.1 million and then not even touching the schools part of it first, for the almost 1.5 million underspending, how much of that are positions that we approved but haven't been able to fill? Is that all the underspending, or is there other things in there?
There are other things in there, such as some contract amounts that were below budget or estimates, and also some savings that departments wanted to realize to be able to buy some one-time equipment that they haven't been able to. And it's not necessarily the same positions that are vacant. If some are filled, then there are, additional positions that open up. But if you would like more detail on the exact number of positions or what those classifications are, we can absolutely provide that.
It'd be helpful, because I think what I heard your conclusion recommendation was on slide 17 is not to touch the underspending. Is that you recommend rolling that into next year?
For now, rolling that into the unassigned fund balance until we bring you a budget amendment to be able to carry some of that forward for dedicated purposes. And that slide 17 shows the top 3 or 4 categories that we are sharing at this very moment.
Okay. So I think my overarching concern is, given that there are so many projects and open positions, I think we discussed extensively in the GovOps meeting, kind of how short-staffed we're in different areas. I guess my first priority would make sure that we can fund all those needs that we've talked about that we haven't been able to, whether that's increase in pay or doing anything extra, bonuses that would help. I'm certainly open to the idea of what Phil presented, but I guess I would start with making sure that we fund all those priorities, true back to the spirit of ARPA funding that we talked about, and be able to lift those up. We've talked extensively about pedestrian safety. I think if I talk about speed cameras and red light cameras anymore, it might rival the number of times I talk about tree lights. So those are things that I think we've heard loud and clear from the community that I would like to see funded. So before we talk about tax rate cuts, which I'm certainly open to, I want to make sure that those priorities we've heard loud and clear from the community get some attention too. So that's it. Thank you. It's certainly a good problem to have right now.
Vice Mayor Connolly, did you have a comment? Okay.
Thanks, Ms. Bawa. I have a couple questions for you. They're kind of basic, but I just to get some historical things out there. Slide 6, you've got our capital reserves projections, and slide 5 is the unassigned fund balance. So 2 questions there. Are the capital reserves in the unassigned fund balance, are they 2 separate funds?
These are 2 separate pots. Okay. The unassigned fund balance is the general fund unassigned fund balance that the policy calls to have between 12 and 17%. And the capital reserve is what this was set up. I can't recall which year, but it was done prior to taking on debt for the major capital projects that were coming. So,
bond rating, we add those 2 together, right?
To come up with available funding balance, yeah. Available balance, yeah.
And what is the available fund balance?
So those are provided in as part of the CIP, and at the moment we are somewhere above 30%. And the idea was to build it up and in advance of the years that we are going to draw down heavy amounts from the capital reserves, as you see from fiscal year 21 onwards. So that was the idea.
And then my second question on slide 6. When does the Mary Ellen Henderson debt come off the books? I remember many charts where we have that showing. Is that 23 or 24?
I'll have to get back to you on that one. We did look into that.
The years 25 and 26,
Oh, 25,
and so that's
26. Okay.
the reason you see that drawdown drop from 4.5 to 2.4. I believe that's
Oh, okay. Okay.
the case.
So that's good to know.
And can I just make one other note since you're on these 2 charts? So in terms of our result of operations relative to the financial plan, we have that $3.1 million surplus. But we still did have, per our plan of finance, a 6.4 million drawdown on our capital reserves. So that surplus, one way of looking at it is, if all that money were moved purely into capital reserves, the drawdown would have been 4 million as opposed to 7 million, which was the plan. So these are all still negative numbers we're talking about, but they are part of a plan where we know we have some big payments that are coming to us through the ground lease once that ground lease is executed. So in Kieran's last slide where she says, let's just keep an eye on our fiscal plan because we haven't yet executed that ground lease, that is what we mean by that. All of these additions are contingent upon that happening, and we're very close. We have every expectation that it will happen, but it hasn't been finally executed.
Right. So you would recommend a conservative approach to anything we do because we do have this big looming plan of finance that has a few pieces that aren't quite all there yet.
I think as the council is thinking both about our ARPA strategies and the deployment of these funds, just keep that big plan of finance in mind. And let's
Right.
not lose complete sight of that. It would be the recommendation.
Okay, thanks. All right, then going to slide 7, you have the results of operations for FY20. Thank you for adding those. That was also affected by the pandemic, that last 3 months or 4 months of FY20. And you mentioned that a little bit. Any idea how that compares to 19? I mean, I guess you can't pull it out of your head. Sorry, I didn't ask sooner.
That's okay.
Like the difference there in the operating revenues in 21 actual and 20 actual, there was a drop off in FY20 from what we expected as well, because we had to make lots of adjustments that spring.
Right. And some of them some of the categories we saw the drops immediately, and some of the others kind of was a little bit of a lag impact. And also the reporting comes to us, the collection, some of them we are 2 months behind on collections. Some like sales tax comes through from another entity, so we are 2 months behind on that. Meals tax, we're 1 month behind on collection, so there's a time lag on some of those.
But that FY20 actual number was pandemic affected.
I think,
Yes.
adding 19 to this, that is something that we could do and take a look at.
Okay. Hold on. In your slide 12, other taxes, is that where the plastic bag tax will be placed if indeed we pass it? In other revenues, other taxes?
I believe so, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. And, all right, those are all my questions. I have some thoughts, but I'll let other people ask questions if they want to.
Go ahead.
Okay. So my thoughts are, because we're still coming out of the pandemic and because we really did constrain some operating and staff didn't receive raises one year, although they got a one-time bonus, because there was hiring that didn't happen, I think it's kind of premature to decide that we're ready to give tax rebates or refunds this soon in the process. As Ms. Hardy said, I would, of course, never rule out tax rebates, but I think it's really important to make sure we're covering all the needs that we have. And we're not really seeing the true picture because we've been so affected over the last 2.5 years in our planning, reporting, adjusting as we go. So I personally do not want to, at this moment, commit to any kind of tax refund or tax rebate, but I'd rather get our whole budget in shape where it needs to be so that our employees can deliver the services that our residents expect and that our residents are paying their taxes for. So that's where I am on this one. And I do appreciate that you included in there the school revenue share. I think for those that are paying attention and don't know what the school revenue share is, the last 3 years we've been able in our budget to work really closely with the school board as we build the budget so that the revenue surpluses are then split between the general government and the schools, because we've all come in at the area of budget, the percentage of budget increase that Ms. Bawa has predicted will happen. So I think that's a really important part of this budget. And even though the schools did have some savings in their expenses, the revenue share, if we are true to the spirit of the revenue share, then next year when the schools are building their budget, they're going to remember that and we'll be able to keep going forward. It's kind of like a zipper or something. Thank you.
All right, thank you very much. Mr. Lichtenhouse.
Thank you. Kieran, thanks for the detailed report. Just a couple questions, then some thoughts, and much like my colleagues here, I've got some additional thoughts, but this is quite a bit to digest in the context of things. So first, let me ask this, Kieran. I just want to point this out for folks that may be watching. On slide 5, we talk about unassigned fund balance, and we look at the floors for our expenditure, 12 and 17%. Does that chart, if you're looking at that chart, tells us that we are safely outside the danger zone in terms of unassigned fund balance at this point?
Is that a question for me? Yeah.
It
So
is.
the way it is positioned right now, we are over our top target of 17%, so we're good. However, we need to not lose sight of that the next few years we have rather large drawdowns on our capital reserve. So, and we are going to be over the 12% of debt service over as a percentage of expenditure. And once that current available balance policy kicks in, which is has a target of 20%, we are over 30 right now. However, it is dependent on receiving the ground lease payments as planned in each of those years, and the tax yields that are built into that model. So I do want to, and any delays, if they're going to be, I mean, those are all the factors that play into it too. So right now we are, however, there are factors that we need to be mindful of in the coming years.
And keep an eye on the ball. I totally get that. I left our Budget and Finance Committee in kind of a very much a glass half full, kind of optimistic attitude for a couple reasons. You know, the last couple of years have been incredibly difficult in council, working with staff and the schools. We were able to put together a budget that allowed us to cut the real estate tax rate, keep the city going, keep eye on the ball in terms of some important projects and initiatives. And although we are not back to where we were in terms of pre-COVID expectations, there is a lot of good news in these numbers, and I think it's important to point that out. Relatively speaking, compared to, you know, I think, kind of the broader fiscal and economic environment out there, Falls Church has navigated some very difficult fiscal waters, I think, very effectively. And I think it's very positive for the city as a whole, especially looking at slide 13. When you look at the performance of taxes that are really kind of a leading indicator, I guess at this point when you're collecting money, maybe a lagging indicator of economic activity, and seeing the growth in some of those areas where we are, you know, we are overperforming compared to where we thought we were going to be when we were staring at a fiscal year 2020 budget conversation. And so again, I know we haven't quite made it back to where we are, but those are some important, I think some important kind of canary in the coal mine in terms of what we're coming out of. I do want to point something out, and a couple of these comments are really to kind of set up a conversation for this upcoming budget cycle. We spend a lot of time talking about the real estate tax rate, and yes, that is important. And I think if anything has been made clear here that we certainly have some more runway to reduce that tax rate in future years. And I will caution, like my fellow colleagues, that you know, we do need to be prudent in our decision making because we are not out of the woods yet when it comes to looking at the surpluses that we've generated. But all of this tells me, in light of the economic activity that we know is on the horizon, the commercial developments that we have approved, projects that are still underway, you know, if we're looking at where things stand now and what I would expect just based on the numbers that we've discussed and what we know are coming out of these projects, you know, some very bright days, some very, I think, I won't say fun conversations when it comes to budget, but maybe less painful conversations from a budget perspective in the next few years the council will be able to have about offering additional tax relief. One area I did want to point out, and I don't want to get on my soapbox about creating kind of an entrepreneurial environment in Falls Church, but I looked down the road in the context of the developments that we were talking about in West Falls Church and other projects and just the overall fabric and the way that we're positioning the city to compete in broader, more regionally. And I look at Falls Church as an area where startups, innovation, entrepreneurial activity take place. You know, you talk about a wonderful education system coupled with all the things that we've done really well and that are just on the horizon from a planning perspective. And we want to entice folks to come to Falls Church to build businesses. And one of the areas that we often overlook because we spend so much time talking about the real estate tax rate is BPOL, which is gross receipts. That's the amount of revenue and sales businesses that operate in this city generate. And in many ways, that particular tax can be a very big line item for professional services companies and other businesses that we talk about bringing into the commercial spaces that we want here. And we talk about driving interest. We talk about marketing Falls Church to bring businesses from outside of the region to relocate here. That's one particular tax that we should keep our eye on. And that's one particular tax, and we talk about how the overall budget is built and what rates and levers we want to move to remove that burden. I think that thinking 5-10 years down the road, we want to create an environment where we are creating an environment of growth and economic activity. And so some of those, some of those kind of secondary taxes that we don't spend a whole lot of time talking about are areas that council may need to focus on going forward. It's a huge, that's a huge growth number over what we expected to get in fiscal year 2020 simply for the V-poll tax. And that's one area where if we want to remain more competitive, we should think about those taxes because they do add up. And so again, for a future budget conversation, not in the context of this surplus, we really need to keep our eye on the ball and make sure that we were doing all of the things that we can to marry actual economic activity and growth with the type of environment that we are trying to build and develop here. And so I do want to point that out. I'll have to echo, many of the comments that folks have made here about, difficult conversation about what do we do with this surplus money. We know that we have some positions to fill, whether it's in the police department, whether it's Department of Public Works. Some folks have had to take, we've had to take some difficult, make some difficult measures and choices in these departments. And I want to make sure operationally from a city perspective that we're filling those kind of gaps from a hiring standpoint and also remaining competitive. So I don't want to be too quick on the trigger. However, with that being said, I'm never one that's going to pass up the opportunity to offer tax relief, but it's something that I like the idea, but it's something that I need to think about, really think about in the context of all of this. And I do want to think closely, and I have some more questions, and maybe it's reserved for conversations with the schools about the surplus and the reserve that they have, whether that's embargoed for certain things, how that plays into this, because those are big numbers too. But I will say my final comment to Vice Mayor Connolly, when I first joined council, she referenced to 3 years where, we've had relatively calm budget conversations with the city, and the Vice Mayor and I both worked very hard, even though we couldn't get it in writing for that spirit of the revenue share. And it was done on a handshake agreement with the school board and our colleagues. And so that's something that, I fully expect to honor because we gave them our word to do that. And I would fully expect for them to honor that when times are bad too. It doesn't mean that we don't have opportunities to spend money in other areas, but regardless of how this shakes out and what that final number is, it is something that we agreed on in handshake and spirit and in practice. And so I'd like to honor that. So again, a lot of really good information here, a lot of room for us to continue to get back to pre-COVID numbers, but it leaves me feeling very good about the future of Falls Church fiscally, and kudos to everyone involved, city, schools, council, that have helped us get here. So that's my comments for tonight. Thank you, Mr. Mayor.
All right, thank you. So Mr. Snyder and then Ms. Hiscott.
I'll defer to Councilmember Hiscott. She'd like to go.
Sure, I just have a couple of quick statements. Thank you for all the work that's gone into this. Along the lines of Ross's comments on driving entrepreneurial growth and business growth within the city, I think, we've demonstrated we've done that pretty well, and we have more areas we can continue to do that. And I think some of that process is relying on investing in our staff in the city. So whether that's, the permits or DPW, making sure our roads are smooth and welcoming as you drive into the city, making sure that it's an easy thing to do to get a new business permit, to build out your current space, to do whatever it is possible. I think that in addition to our people, we want to make sure we have the systems in place. Like, you can't do a lot of it electronically right now. Whether you're applying for a job or applying for a permit, and there are other jurisdictions that have that. I think taking some of this funding and ensuring that we're investing in our systems is also a good return on our investment, both for our residents and for businesses that are interested in being in Falls Church. So I look forward to those discussions on how to use the surplus. And of course, as a taxpayer, I'm always interested in that rate as well. But I want to make sure we invest in our staff and our systems to continue to drive the economic growth that we see here in Falls Church City, especially as we bring on several large developments and are looking at 2 more in the next couple months. Thank you.
All right, thank you. Mr. Snyder?
Sure, thanks a lot. First, a question. Do we have a sense about real estate taxes, where they're going? I didn't see specific reference to them, and they're about 75% of our revenue. So, Karen, can you tell me a little bit about that?
Yes, sure, Mr. Snyder. So real estate taxes, as far as the collections go, are good. They are in the attachment of the staff report. Each tax category is broken down. However, the abatements are higher than what we had budgeted. We had budgeted 400,000, and the abatements came in at 560,000. And also the tax relief came in about 70,000, 80,000 more than what was budgeted. So the real estate taxes is under budget by 180,000, which is 0.3%. Not a huge number. However, these are things that we're going to need to be mindful of when we develop the next year's budget, and how we budget for the abatements and the. I will need to work with the treasurer's office to see if these are specifically COVID related, and if there is, or if these are more on an ongoing basis, and if we need to adjust for these going forward.
Right, and I'm sorry. And what percentage of the real estate taxes are commercial versus personal?
As far as the assessed value goes, the commercial is, the break is 30% to 70%, and the commercials include the apartments and the multifamily.
Be interested in is adding to our knowledge base the best projections for both the real estate taxes that we're getting and where we think they may be going in the next year or two. Because I think that's very relevant considering the size of the real estate taxes being about, 75% of our total revenues. Secondly, Phil Duncan puts forward a very interesting proposal, and it looks to be really quite good. So my question is, what's wrong with it? In other words, why shouldn't we do what he's proposing? The three elements, including the tax refunds. So that appears to be really quite attractive, but worthy of further discussion in connection with any of the capital funds. Secondly, so it caught my attention because the city manager introduced all of this with a 15 to 20% of the workforce is unfilled. So I'm going to have a lot of questions about that. Mr. City Manager, what's your base for the 15 or 20%? In other words, what was your assumed level of personnel? Was that previously approved by us and theoretically funded, or is this your idea of what you would like to see or should see? So I want to learn a lot more about that, because a number of our citizens have said the park maintenance is an issue, permits are an issue, police I hope is not an issue, but may be, transportation, the amount of time it takes to move projects forward may be an issue. So I want to learn a lot more about that before I commit anything. If this is something that we need to put funds on, hopefully we can still give tax relief. But I note that in Phil's proposal, he would still provide, $1.34 million to the schools and city. Do we need more than that? And if so, what do we need and how do we need it to fill the fundamental positions? So I want to know a lot more about that. What's your base number of positions? How did you come about that? And then let's take a look at that, and then look at which positions ought to be filled on a priority basis, working with you and making sure that we're funding that not only this year, but our projections for future years will be sufficient to fund those, either with surplus, with ARPA money as appropriate, or not, well, as only as appropriate, and that. So I'm interested in that. I think those are my 3 points. Number one, Phil Duncan's proposal looks very good on the surface. It's got some key components that I really like, especially some tax relief, but I want to know what the vulnerabilities may be. Secondly, I really want to know where the real estate taxes are going this year and likely to go next year as part of our planning. And then finally, I want to know a lot more about what employees we need, what functions, what are the priorities, and how we move out to get those positions filled. Thank you.
All right, we have 2 additional comments, 3 additional comments, so let's just start down here and work our way down. Mr. Lickenhouse, Ms. Hardy, then Mrs.
Sure. Just because this has come up a few times, and not sure the mechanics of how this works. So in terms of tax relief, what we're talking about here, are we talking tax refund checks? Are we talking about banking money for future tax rate relief? What are the mechanics of what's being discussed here? When people say tax rate relief, how is that choreographed? What are we talking about here?
Well, I mean, I think there are probably different things we could talk about, but there actually was, I guess about 8 years ago, some of the old timers remember that we did actually quote a 3-way split.
The old.
Where money actually did come back to taxpayers at the, I guess in the end of the year, right? Was that it, or the beginning of the year? But then there also is the possibility of next year, next year's rate drops down.
Okay, so so just so I understand, we're talking about either stroking a check back to folks as a refund between now and the end of the year, or banking this money and then potentially using that to offset and lower the tax rate for fiscal year 2023?
So whatever rate we'd be setting in the spring,
Yeah.
which is 22, which I guess would be 23, unless I'm doing the numbers wrong.
Okay, just to be clear, not aware of the
So just
mechanics of how
a
this
couple of
works here.
comments on it. I think right now, we're just hearing different ideas and concepts. In terms of a schedule, what staff is putting forward, at least notionally, and this is one of the key things we want council to feed back on tonight, is a plan where we would go out to the public over the next 3 weeks or so to get feedback on the ARPA plan, which we're going to discuss in just a moment, but we can also discuss with the public the year-end financials, and then come back in mid-November with a work session where we'll discuss the input that we've gotten and start sort of putting it together in the form of an action for the City Council to take as a budget amendment. So in terms of mechanics of, the year-end dollars, anything that is done should be done with a kind of a one-time spending mindset. And so capital investments, employee bonuses, or a rebate would be, if a rebate is the way the council wanted to go, would be probably the things that would be in your quiver of arrows to consider. The rate is best considered in the spring when you have your hands on your operating budget. If you do a tax rate out of sync with the operating budget, then you have
Sure.
created a structural imbalance.
Okay, that's why I was asking. I got you. What is Phil Phil, what are you proposing? Just so I'm clear, so I can think about this. Are you proposing the rebate?
As I said at the beginning, I'm agnostic on which of the 3, avenues to take. I guess maybe it's 2 avenues, but as the mayor said, us old timers remember when a rebate check was issued. That's one option. Some sort of a credit on the next tax bill would be another option, or as the manager suggests, build in a certain amount of money now that we know will be produced when we devise the budget. So in other words, we go in, he goes into the formation of his budget with the notion a certain amount of money is going to be set aside for tax rate reduction.
And so all this will be laid out in terms of these options and what money's being recommended to go over, because I'm still not clear in terms of how that would work with what staff has presented as part of the potential use of one-time funds. But I have confidence that between now and the next meeting, I will have that figured out if we need information. So, okay.
Ms. Hardy?
And if I could, in the same way that Ms. Bawa said, we're going to put money aside for the anticipating the payment from Westfall. We're making assumptions that we're going to get some money and we're going to devote it to various uses. This would be another such assumption. I guess we could consider it that way.
I'm a numbers person, so I just have to see it all laid out in nice boxes, pluses and minuses. Okay, thanks.
Ms. Hardy?
Thanks. I had one question and then one request. So I think a big unknown that Karen was talking about is whether we're going to get the next payment from the West Falls project. Is that planned in April, Wyatt?
Yes, the expected, so the outside closing date is April 30th. The development team has indicated to us that they're currently shooting for the end of March.
Okay. So that should work out pretty well for our budget cycle then as well. Okay, so we'll have more certainty there, so that's good. And then a request. So between slide 5 and slide 6, we talked briefly about this earlier, but given that we have that new financial policy that we adopted that kicks in when we have too much debt, which we're coming into now, instead of just showing the unassigned fund balance, which obviously is very well funded currently, can we show a chart that has that total available reserves and then where we are relative to that new policy that we're supposed to be holding ourselves to? And that's the combination.
Sure, we can do that.
Yeah, I
Sure.
think that's just a more useful thing because we keep looking at this and it looks like we're great, but there's a reason why we passed that new financial policy, right? Which was because we know we're coming into a lot of debt and we want to hold ourselves to that new number.
Sure, yeah, when we bring you a budget amendment, we'll definitely make sure all those details are provided.
Scott?
I had a similar question on combining those two as well, but I'm on while we're looking at the staffing levels that are down, because my understanding is that we are down in police and DPW and in permitting. I'd also like to know, an estimated expense for going online with some of our systems to make those who are employed in those departments more as effective as possible. For instance, I know we have a Munis system and HR that will allow us to do that, but we have to set aside funding for training and funding for the time to implement some of those systems that I think even the short run, will make us more effective and have a higher return on investment. Because if I can invest in hiring somebody to collect, outstanding revenues, for instance, and get them hired more quickly, obviously you can bring in the revenues more quickly. The same with permits. The sooner we can do that, the more effectively we can do that, the more effectively we can bring businesses online and start collecting from our taxes, et cetera. So when looking at staffing, I also want to have an understanding of, are there, I know those are two systems in particular that would make the staff that we do have more effective. So what's the estimated cost of that and time frame for training and dollars for that? I was speaking to a small business owner who owns a business in Falls Church City and in Fairfax, and they were just running me through the permitting process for opening up both and how one's online, it's accessible, it's easier and more quickly accessed, and had them opening up faster in Fairfax. So I want to make sure that we're investing in people and in processes to make sure that's most effective. Thank you.
All right, thank you very much. If I were to say anything, I'd repeat what my colleagues have already said, so I don't think that's necessary, but I do share the comments and concerns and things mentioned by my colleagues. Let's move on now, Ms. Bawa, and go on to the next. I'm sorry, did you have something else you wanted to say?
I do have a question.
Okay, go ahead, sure.
This relates to Mr. Duncan's numbers. And again, I know this is all very theoretical, but if I heard you right, you were saying spend $1.37 million in each of 3 buckets? And you're getting that total from adding up the revenue surplus, the under expenditure surplus within general government, and the under expenditure surplus within the schools?
Yeah, the total number that Karen's got in her report at the end, which comes through to us from the schools, as I understand it, is $893,000, I think, is their combined surplus. I mean, that's the number that was on the papers that we were given.
Not to give the schools the full revenue share split, but rather put all that money into a big ball and divide it up differently.
I suppose you could consider it that way. I mean, certainly everybody's entitled to their own interpretation of what our revenue sharing agreement is or our handshake or whatever. I mean, I look at, just the dollar figures on our side, on their side, and we're all in this together, and I put them together and would divide them in a way that everybody gets an equal share.
Okay, so I guess this just needs a little more playing out because it's an equal share of things that people didn't spend and people that weren't hired, and so that that requires a lot more thinking, which we have time to do. Thank you.
Yeah, certainly it's very important to discuss the underspending and to address that both on the city and the school side. You remember at the meeting Friday, I asked whatever the schools to offer their thoughts on, prioritizing their underspending needs that they'd like to correct. And I'd love to see the same thing on the city side too, as others have said here tonight, so that we can, have a full picture of what are the most urgent positions that need to be filled, technology that needs to be purchased, and prioritize that across the city, both city and schools.
All right, Ms. Bowell, why don't you go on to the next part of your presentation?
And if I could just do a quick setup for this as well. So tonight we do have just an update for council. We're going to go through some numbers of a proposed structure and some concepts for the investments that we could make as a community with our ARPA allocation. The decision we're really looking for tonight from the City Council is sort of your judgment on that structure. Do you believe that that is a good structure to take out to the public, to get the public to react to, and to give feedback on? Or would you like to spend more time with this, working just directly with staff on kind of what that structure looks like before we take it out to the public for feedback? I think kind of that's one of the key decisions for tonight after tonight's briefing for you. What you'll see is staff's workout following the principles that the council's already articulated and following the rules that the U.S. Treasury has laid out. And I want to pause and really thank Cindy Mester for all of your work and coming to understanding of that and really leading finance directors across the Commonwealth of Virginia to understand those things. Cindy's been a key state leader in that. Another example of the city kind of batting above its weight. So let me turn it over to Kieran to walk us through this. And when we get into the numbers part, we'd really like to have a council discussion. Are we going in the right direction on this? Is this sort of the body of a structure that you'd like to take out to the public, or do we need to do some more work on it? Ms. Bawa?
Good evening again. So we have ARPA funds. The city was allocated a total of, next slide please. The city was allocated a total funding of $18 million, which was received as part of two allocations, one as an independent city of $2.8 million, and the other one as through the Commonwealth as pass-through funds for non-entitlement units of $15.2 million. So together that makes up $18 million, of which we received $9 million, our first tranche, in June of this year, and the remaining $9 million is expected in June of next year. The city has until December of 2024 to encumber the funds, and until December 2026 to expend these funds. So as I'll go rather quickly on these. As Mr. Shields mentioned, when this information was new, city staff worked with council to come up with these guiding principles along the lines of what the GFOA, the General Finance Officers Association, came up with, and the guiding principles were set to provide tangible relief to the community, the residents, businesses, schools, employees, invest in long-held city priorities, which is consistent with adopted vision and work plan at the city, creating lasting transformational impact with long-term recurring investments, if permissible, under the U.S. Treasury guidance, of course, and incorporating community, school, and department level input from all stakeholders. Then also making sure that the expenditures related to ARPA funding should be spread over the qualifying period through December of 2024 for encumbrance to enhance the budgetary financial stability, as well as ensure that use of ARPA funds to cover operating deficits caused by COVID should be considered very temporary and one time, and ensure that there are no structural balance issues in the future, so imbalance. So those were the principles that were set. Along with that, and the U.S. Treasury interim guidance that came up, which is still being revised. A final version is expected hopefully soon. And council input at a couple of, or three rather, work sessions that we had in May, June, and July, and public input at those as well. Discussions with city and school staff across various departments, level directors, and there is a premium pay task force which provided recommendations on eligibility, and as well as recommendations on what eligible premium pay positions would be, the classifications. That, along with creation of project level applications, so that any project request is made with details providing the milestones, the funding required spread across time frame, as well as the scope of the project, in order to make sure that it meets the U.S. Treasury's eligibility as well as the requirements set by federal procurements. So incorporating all those, a preliminary investment plan has been developed, and we'll go through that in the next few slides. The total ARPA allocation was 18 million. The council allocated 1,061,500 in September budget amendment, leaving a balance of a little short of 17 million, 16,943. The plan that we are about to present, framework of various categories and keeping the guiding principles, is 19.58 million, which is over by 2.6 million of the funding level. The next slide, 23, shows at a high level how the funding has been broken down in various categories. These categories align with the expenditure categories provided by the U.S. Treasury, and there are short-term projects, as well as looking at more long-term transformational projects, infrastructure type, that are being funded with these proposed for consideration. And public health, little short of 4 million of that total pie, and negative economic impacts at 1.8 million. Services to disproportionately impacted communities at 4.1 million. Premium pay for $500,000. Infrastructure 7.6 million. And revenue replacement at 1.4 million, and administrative needs, which include staff for procurement and grant management at 320,000, for a total of 19. And if the same information in the next chart is shown as a pie chart. 40% of the total is being set as being proposed in this preliminary plan for infrastructure, stormwater mitigation, 20% each for public health and services to disproportionately impacted communities, and leaving the remaining 20% for revenue replacement, negative economic impacts, and premium pay. So that makes up the total allocation. Looking more at each category, just honing in a bit more into this, the preliminary investment plan, the first category was public health. So the proposed plan that we have so far has about 100,000 for collectively for testing, vaccinations, contact tracking, personal protective equipment, services for health transportation services for underprivileged, dental care assistance. And the right side of this chart shows the breakdown of that request on a year as needed, as need-based. And then 500,000 for HVAC improvements at the schools to match a grant with an equal amount coming from their another federal funding source that they have. 800,000 for HVAC improvements for General City at the community center, and park improvements for requesting a total of 2.45 million spread across all the way through to 2025. The next slide provides a breakdown of the park improvements. The request is for Cherry Hill Barn stage at the Cherry Hill Barn for 200,000. Fellows Park Development for 500,000. Court lights, sports light at the courts, basketball and tennis courts at 3 parks, and those are going to be at Crossman, as well as Cavalier Trail and Bourbon Park, and then playground equipment replacement, again at 3 different parks with 750,000. There is another proposal for outdoor programming space for classes that can happen outside, like music and art classes for 225,000, and also increased art and culture grants. This is in addition to the existing amounts that are already there for 75,000, 25,000 in 3 years. This is to support the fact that there is a demand for a lot of outside activity, that is outdoors activity that has taken place in during the COVID time. Next slide, please. The next category is the negative economic impacts for a total of 1.8 million. 240,000 of that is as a direct assistance, like a grant guaranteed payments to households below specific AMI income across 2 years. Assistance for food, rent, and utilities, continuation of that has been appropriated for fiscal year 22 already as part of the first tranche, and continuation of the SNAP at farmers market. The larger chunk of this category is assistance for smaller businesses, 500,000 each for a 3-year window for a total request of 1.5 million there. Next slide. Services to disproportionately impacted communities. The schools have a request for mental health professionals. There was one that was added as part of the first tranche appropriation, so continuation of that position, as well as 2 additional positions for mental health professionals at the school, for a total ask of 928,000 all the way through 2025. Affordable housing program to the 1.9 in 2022 is for the Virginia Village purchase, and the additional 1 million for future initiatives in the strike fund. Childcare assistance for 150,000 for the first 2 years for employees as well as residents. And then ventilation improvements at Winter Hill Senior Facility with new windows for 130,000. Infrastructure. So this is a larger, longer-term investment that the city is proposing for use of ARPA funds. So this would use 3.5 million for Hillwood Avenue 1 and Sharrow Avenue projects, and 4.1 million for green infrastructure practices along Lincoln Avenue. So this would address 3 of the 6 projects that are in the pipeline for stormwater mitigation projects, with increased scope on one of the projects. This increased scope makes it eligible for ARPA, so that's why this proposal has been defined in such a way. Moving along, A revenue replacement is for sidewalks and pedestrian pathways for 1.15 million, and a replacement of some bus shelters across the city for 250,000. Premium pay, according to the task force recommendations for one-time premium pay for eligible employees, 255 each for the city and general government. City and school staff. The last category is administrative, and that is for assistance to adhere with the procurement regulations for meeting the U.S. Treasury's interim rule, as well as grant compliance all the way out to 2026 until we close out the use of these funds. So that makes a total, as if we look at the totals at each year for fiscal year 2022, it makes a total request of, at this preliminary frameworks, at 3.8 million, 3.75. So as Mr. Shields said, the next steps involve getting community input on this framework based on the spending categories provided by the U.S. Treasury, and bringing a revised updated plan to council at its work session on November 15th, with a budget amendment, a first reading on November 22nd and a second reading on anticipated on December 13th. And the community input steps that are expected from October 19th all the way through until we bring the first, at the work session, the first reading paperwork, would involve that we publish this preliminary plan extensively online in the newspaper and the Focus newsletter, and disseminate the information through the various social media channels to make sure we reach the residents and the community that works, businesses, and seek input from businesses and residents with online as well as community town halls. The format could be virtual, hopefully one during the daytime, one during the evening. Their discussions are in collaboration with the school to make sure that the outreach is collectively done for these funds, and advocacy with legislators on Virginia spending plan overall at the state level. So that is the plan for this initial framework that has been set up for this ARPA funds. And I will stop right here, and we happy to take any questions.
Very much. I imagine there's more than a few questions. Ms. Hardy?
Thank you. Thank you, Karen. This is really good work. Appreciate all the detailed recommendations. So I'm going to start with kind of just general comments before diving into the details. So looking on slide 24, I think at a glance, being able to spend 40% of the ARPA funds on infrastructure kind of meets the spirit of what we talked about, which is making investments, and then a quarter of it on kind of services to lift those who are most impacted by ARPA. That generally kind of passes a gut check. I think it certainly would be beneficial to hear from the community. A question on kind of how we might deploy the 17 million that's left. I think in the past, Wyatt, you've talked about doing kind of multiple tranches to reserve flexibility because there might be unknowns or new needs that come up. But is that still the plan?
It is, and I think just in terms of numbers, so let's say the council said, this is the plan, we like it exactly like this. So we would then, the city council would appropriate, Karen, what is the number in FY22? It's something like $3 million in FY22, and the remaining 14 or 13 million would be then appropriated on an annual basis in the out years. I believe it's like something like 3.6 million is what we have identified for uses in FY22 in this preliminary plan.
So that would be important to set expectations with the community, because I think as you show all these slides of all these great projects that we hope to get to, it'll be good to manage their expectations. Like, these are things that we want to do for the entire 17 or 18 million. Don't expect them all to happen tomorrow. I think that's probably an important part. And along the same lines, I think a question I continue to field is a lot of people believe the ARPA funds are a blank check. And I think important in the community engagement process is to start with all the various rules, and why stormwater is, a large chunk of it is because that is one of the things that qualifies, and why we can't do more traffic calming or pedestrian improvements because that comes from the revenue category. So I think that's just an important thing to make sure people understand all the rules and restrictions. And on that note is, I guess, the combined 1.4 million revenue replacement plus administrative costs, so the 1.7 million, is that the max that we have in that more loose revenue replacement category?
Let me refer to Cindy Mester on that.
Yeah, I was trying to move to the
With
right.
finance and Cindy together on that.
Yeah, I think it'd be a good combination. We don't have the final rules yet for what they're going to allow for revenue replacement, and as we've discussed, we've put in a request for them to modify so they're not counting things like MBTA one-time single-purpose grants. So this is our current allocation with a conservative approach, so we're not allocating it all until we hear what that final number is. So our current estimate is higher than this, but we're being cautious because we don't have the final rules, because this is the one area that is significantly still in play.
Got it. So in terms of kind of community input I've heard so far, besides kind of the stormwater infrastructure, putting that aside, it really goes back to kind of pedestrian safety and traffic calming. For those projects, is that the only bucket that would qualify under, is the 1.7 or potentially a little higher? Or do we think it could qualify under some other category?
The other categories, very unlikely. We'd have to look at it very specifically because we'd have to determine public health or services to disproportionately impacted communities. And now that they've set out the documentation that we have to prepare to certify, 95% sure I can't get it to fit in another category yet.
Okay. Well, let's keep that in mind because, again, I think those are the top two things I hear. So moving on to specifics. So starting with slide 25, all the details. So for all the public health items, given that we've been deploying money in those areas already, I think it would be helpful to show how much we've spent to date as just important context and backdrop of, hey, we've spent this much on testing or this much on PPE, and we've used this much from CARES or the first allocation of ARPA. That helps set these numbers in context so we know, like, does that seem reasonable for what we need coming out of the pandemic, or do we think we need more? For the park items on slide 26, they all look familiar. Are they all in the CIP currently, or are there new projects in there that we haven't seen before?
The majority are in the CIP. The Cherry Hill Barn Stage is not, and that came out of our brainstorming with staff and advisory board because of the outdoor nature of activities. The same would be true for the outdoor programming space. That is not in the CIP because that's a new idea to have another covered roof outdoor 12 months of a year opportunity due to COVID. Arts and culture is an operating grant, so that's not in the CIP, but it is consistent with council action in the past. This money would be specifically for operating monies for economic impact from dark theaters, loss of income. Fellows and playground equipment are in the CIP. The sports court lighting, our local parks are in the CIP. The one that's not in the CIP would be doing the baseball field at Meridian because that wasn't included in the school construction project.
Got it. So just from a process perspective, while all those things sound good, given that things in the CIP normally are vetted through the budget annual budget process and the Planning Commission takes a crack at it, are there things that are also in the CIP that don't get prioritized here that should be? And just something that you don't need to answer now, but I think from a process perspective, I think it's important to think about that, it's great that these things bubbled up, but, I'd hate for projects that have been sitting in the CIP that might have an opportunity to be funded and then couldn't be funded because these new ideas came up outside of the process.
I think that's an important point. And when you look at the multimodal pedestrian savings, some of those sidewalk things would be in the CIP, so there are some in that area. A lot of the other CIP items are not eligible when we look at public safety radios in the CIP or the IT cybersecurity type things. So there are other CIP items that won't be eligible under ARPA, but we definitely have looked at where we could use ARPA for CIP items, one, because as you noted, they're vetted, and two, it reduces needing the issuance of debt.
Got it.
And one other note, if I could, as we go to the community engagement and the rules, I think, Ms. Hardy, that's really important. It's also important to remember this preliminary plan is 2.6 million over our allocation, so we need to still prioritize down.
Got it. And so still on the park items, I recall some of these were going to be funded from VC money, like Founders Row, for example. I think we received our VC money from Founders Row 1 opening this summer. So what was the financing plan for these? And given that if we're going to use ARPA dollars for it, that's good news, because either we free up VC dollars or we don't have to debt finance them as planned. Do we know for each of these things what the original funding plan was and what that means for future debt capacity or VC money that might be available now?
The Founders Row money was going towards master planning, so this doesn't cover all of the master planning, but we can double check with what year and which project that was aligned to.
So when we were talking about the good news budget surplus, I think when we talk about with the community, I think we've got ARPA surplus, or the ARPA dollars, we got the FY21 surplus, and then we have the Founders Row money that we came into. It probably would be good to share and just have transparency around how all these different buckets of funds are getting deployed. It's a lot for us to keep track of ourselves. So moving on to slide 28. So for the affordable housing one, that's good to see an investment there. Is the combination of the 1.9 and the 1 million going to refund both the city council and the EDA for their purchases, or is it just the council reserves?
There's two components in this concept. The first part is to refinance the units at Virginia Village, and in that, which is a 90% LTV, we would use around 1 to 1.5 million to finish out that financing plan and fully reimburse city council and the EDA. The rest of the money would be to go into the acquisition strike fund and basically parallel the grant that we applied to for Amazon so that we could purchase and consolidate even additional units, and most likely with the timeline under the control of council for ARPA, if this project was be approved, we'd have this available for the strike fund prior to an award from Amazon.
Okay, so I'm hearing that
Virginia Housing.
if we do this, then we would not be dependent on the Amazon grant to refund the council reserves and the EDA. Is that right?
Correct.
Okay.
And it would still be a revolving loan fund for the other portion, so we'd continue to purchase. But yes, we wouldn't be dependent on Amazon.
Got it.
Refi.
That will be good news to the EDA. Slide 29, so stormwater. I think I heard you say that this is only 3 out of the big 6 projects. Is that right?
Yeah, and so the difficulty with the stormwater is that, and Cindy kept telling me this, and I wasn't kind of fully absorbing it, but there is a water quality requirement for the use of ARPA dollars on stormwater projects. And some of our projects are pure expansion projects that are in the big 6. And so that's why it's not kind of as simple as take the big 6 and fully fund it with ARPA dollars in lieu of debt.
Got it. So I guess 2 follow-up questions then. What's the plan on the other 3 projects? Are we going to have to debt finance that? Because I would hate to talk about how to spend $18 million and then have to go issue a bunch of debt to take care of the other ones.
So that is what the expectation would need to be. We would still need to finance those others unless some other form of funding would become available through the infrastructure bill, which is working its way through very slowly.
Slowly.
But that would be the other opportunity potentially for stormwater.
And what's the timing of that? Is that the next budget season?
So that's the difficulty. It could slow it down. And one other note, just in terms of using federal dollars, even for the allocations that we have made, it does increase the cost of those projects and it does slow them down a little bit, but it's certainly worth it to avoid that expense for our taxpayers.
And these projects, fortunately, are ones that don't have high right-of-way requirements outside of our public easement, and that's really important when you're using federal dollars because there's very constringent regulations around that. And I will note that as part of our advocacy for changes in the final rule, we advocated that stormwater, one, we had to make sure we got stormwater defined as eligible, so that was a big milestone. The second one is that quality isn't the only issue related to inland and urban flooding, as you all are very intimately aware. And we do think that we should be able to define quantity as impacting quality, because if you're stopping that big humongous flow downstream and causing sediment and erosion, et cetera, it's quality. That we're still waiting for a ruling on. We're hoping to be optimistic, but this is an interpretation and eligibility based on current U.S. Treasury guidelines.
Got it. So if I understood correctly, that's like the first bad news that you shared with us in this meeting, where we're not taking care of the other three. And so I don't want to set up a plan where we're spending a bunch of dollars and then actually have to turn around and increase the stormwater fee because we have 3 projects that don't get funded. So I guess that probably needs more discussion around how we might do that between potentially the FY21 surplus we talked about, whether that can be deployed against some stormwater work since it won't qualify for ARPA, or when we might find out details of whether it will qualify. But that feels like a very confusing conversation for the community of, hey, we have a surplus in this year, we're getting $18 million, but then we're going to increase your stormwater fee next year, right? That just doesn't make sense to me. So let's think through more about what we can do there. The second part of my question was, if quality projects or quantity projects don't qualify, I know that we had gotten a really detailed recommendation from the Stormwater Task Force around green infrastructure projects. So if there are any of those that are, I guess, shovel-ready, namely, I think Lincoln Avenue had a really creative proposal how to make it a green street. I would love for us to invest in something like that, especially something that's more visible to the community. Gray infrastructure is great, big pipes, all great, but I think the green stuff is just as important. And so if that qualifies, I would love to make sure that we think about those and not just the big 6.
And we have here, in terms of what you see for Lincoln Avenue, and also that was tied to the grant resolution that council just did for transportation alternatives when VDOT ruled that we could only do quantity, not quality, just to change funding sources criteria. And so we have put the quality pieces here and have worked really well to tie projects together so that when we're looking at how they run into each other, like Trammell Branch, for example, part of it's quantity, but it's running into a quality piece. So we have maximized it. This is one area, while we don't have the final regs, I don't expect a major change from the U.S. Treasury because they purposely picked 2 EPA existing programs to make it administratively easy. And they're both quality-oriented, clean water and drinking water, so I don't think we'll see a lot of change. But we can look holistically at our funding sources as we message this to the community.
Okay. So moving on to hazard pay, that's been important to me to have pay equity across kind of all of our frontline workers. Does the $500,000 combined there take care of kind of everyone who worked through COVID that couldn't social distance, had to be in person?
It works through, if I may, Mr. Shields, to answer 2 tests. One is essential workers who were in person, working with people, and had to handle things handled by others. That's one test. And the other test is they have to be in critical infrastructure. So they have to be essential in person and either education, transportation, child care, public safety, public health, or what the locality deems as critical to public health and the well-being of residents. I will tell you that one's not defined by the U.S. Treasury, so we're looking at that very carefully. But we are picking up, looking at the schools list and ours, a large majority of the employees because of in-person working with people and critical infrastructure. Some of the nuances are the counter people that weren't out in the field working directly with, kids during the Rec Connect, for
And again,
example.
I think being able to figure out kind of what qualifies for ARPA and what we have to use our local revenue surplus is important, because I think the policy here is that anyone who had to work in person and couldn't social distance should be compensated similarly. And I know that we had certain job categories where it didn't qualify based on the CARES Act rules. And so I don't really care where the pot of money comes from. But I think the end result is we want to reward our employees fairly and equitably. And so as long as that's delivered, that's fine. Yep. So that we already talked about the revenue replacement. So I know that we're probably constrained on what qualifies there, but besides sidewalks, pedestrian pathways, bus shelters, really investing around kind of other pedestrian safety measures are really important. Again, I will talk about cameras again. I would love to see those implemented because we hear time and again that it's not only important to make sure that we build our roads to be pedestrian oriented, but we also have the enforcement. And I know that it's not feasible to have police at every intersection everywhere all the time. And so now that we have the ability to use speed cameras and deploy extra red light cameras, I really would like to see that to be a priority for us. So that's it for my detailed questions. In terms of kind of the engagement process and with the community, besides making sure we're very upfront about kind of how the ARPA dollars are not a blank check, the joint engagement process with the schools really makes sense to me. I think we want to solicit one set of inputs from the community. I think the schools, in fact, are having like a big strategic planning thing they're doing at the end of this month. So we're probably going to just confuse the community if we do too many multiple sessions. But let's hear from the community for what inputs they have on how these dollars should be spent, hopefully in one joint process. And then my last point around communicating is, let's think through kind of the channels. I think it was very apparent from our on-site meeting with the residents of the fields that while we think we're doing a good job communicating through the online newsletters and the newspaper and social media, at the end of the day, you really need to go to the people. People are just really busy with their jobs and their families and don't have time to check all these channels. So let's make sure we are more creative and we don't end up using channels that selectively bias certain members of the community. So that's it. Thank you. Thank you for all the time.
All right, let's go on to other folks' comments. Mr. Snyder?
Sure.
Ms. Hiscott?
Councilmember Hisco, do you want to go? Okay. Okay, thanks. So a couple things. I'm a little bit concerned about putting out a proposal that actually exceeds the $18 million. There may be a reason for doing that, but initially it seems to me not a good thing to do. Secondly, if I were to divide this up, it would be between pandemic response and recovery, critical public services like public safety writ large. By that I mean police, fire, emergency medical services, pedestrian safety, including speed limits and enforcement, and to echo Councilmember Hardy's request for as many speed cameras and red light cameras as we can responsibly put in. And I know the legislature continues to restrict both of those things. And third would be long-term investments, particularly infrastructure. And I think Councilmember Hardy also mentioned the stormwater issue, and I share her interest and concerns unless we fund that at a higher level than we're proposing. Well, putting in numbers is an interesting exercise. They're going to get political almost immediately with people wanting more. So if we present this, we've got to say the numbers are purely for illustrative purposes, based upon staff's best judgment. But I mean, I'd frankly like to dig into each of these numbers. Do we really need, how many businesses really need the money? How many households really were negatively affected by COVID? So you could dig into each one of these numbers in great detail. So I'm concerned about unreasonable expectations being created. At the same time, you got to start somewhere. So I would just, however you have to do under the ARPA legislation, the particular categories you have to use, to me, the categories that I've suggested are much more clear. And perhaps it's another chart. For example, there are some things under one category that are actually infrastructure, like some of the parks work. My view is clearly infrastructure. Yet for our purposes, it's put under a different category. So those are the comments I had right now. I may have more. Thanks.
All right, Ms. Hiscott?
Thank you. I think my colleagues have covered a lot of them. I just had two clarification or questions. And I'm looking at the sidewalks and pedestrian pathways like we've talked about. Agree with both of my colleagues on investments there. And I'm assuming that the dollar amount indicates that this is just repairing. This isn't doing any kind of undergrounding or any of the things we've talked about with accessibility on roads like Columbia or on Broad. Because those dollar amounts wouldn't cover that, right? This is just
Yeah, this is more focused on missing sidewalks and ADA curb ramps associated with crosswalks. It is definitely not for undergrounding.
So that still remains, another infrastructure and pedestrian safety and accessibility issue. And then similarly with any road construction, that's prohibited from these, we're looking to infrastructure bills for that, not ARPA dollars. Because that's the other request I've gotten. I just want to be clear on that.
Yeah, we have infrastructure requests in through the coordination with Congressman Byers' office for both stormwater and pedestrian, and that would be separate and later. And there's a lot of focus on that for broadband and other transportation. And I will note things like undergrounding, while we need it, isn't going to fit under an ARPA eligible activity, and so that's the balance we've been working through as we put this preliminary plan together.
And on the quantity, on getting a redefinition of quantity, this is back to stormwater, I apologize, quantity defined as quality. You don't think there's going to be any movement, you said, on that? It seems logical to me that definition, if you are looking at where one goes into the other, and you're looking at that quantity absolutely impacts quality. But
I am not optimistic on a change because they've built it to date around the two specific federal EPA programs. In working with our peers and with our stormwater engineers, we are looking really, really close at that and seeing how we can connect them. But it's definitely, and they haven't defined, does it have to be 50% quality or 95% quality? So I just want to set expectations. We're looking to see how best we can get as much as we can under the eligible. I do not, while it's not final yet, and we did raise that as an issue, I'm not optimistic on that front that we'll see a federal change on the regulations.
Okay, and then a lot of the climate action plan that we talked about last Monday's meeting also doesn't qualify for these funds, correct?
Correct. The core tenet of this legislation is to respond to the pandemic health and economic impact, and you have to impact and have benefits to existing residents and businesses now. So some of that is longer term planning and some of it won't impact now. There might be some small things. Kate and I have been looking at it, but it's...
Yeah, I just wanted to clarify because we've been talking about how that's one of our priorities, and I just want to make sure people understood why it doesn't fit into this category. Thank you.
All right, Mr. Lichtenhouse?
Thanks. So going back to the park improvements, so if most of these are in the CIP, does funding these through ARPA, does this actually speed those projects up?
In
get these
terms
done
of
faster?
pulling them forward in the CIP, I think we'd probably have to go through project by project to respond to that question. I think generally, because these are federal dollars, speeding them up is only would be the case if it's allowing us to do it like a full year in advance.
Mm-hmm.
But all of them are going to have significant, Bacon-Davis requirements and a lot of administration that just naturally slows the projects down.
Okay. I mean, I feel these are all important. I will say, generally speaking, and Councilman Snyder said this very succinctly and very well, and I agree with almost all of his comments. I mean, the infrastructure, the parks, the pedestrian safety, the stormwater, so the long-term capital improvements, creating walkability, again, infrastructure-related, long-term capital investments are the things that I'm interested in prioritizing. And I do think that we need to try to reconcile this to the actual dollars that are available. I was concerned when we allocated that initial $1 million, you start chipping away at it, and boy, it's certainly been illustrated here that, we've got our wish list, and now we're even $1 million behind, and now we're 2.6 off of this wish list. So I think we need to reconcile that and get these dollars to net out before trying to make this sell for input to the public. The business and economic assistance. Can you give me some more details behind what that is? Are this the micro grants similar to what EDA did? What does that entail exactly?
So they're still, the EDO is still working with the Chamber of Commerce and the business community on kind of what the best strategies on that will be, and they're getting input on that. They would actually like to have a kind of an input form that the businesses could provide, just to give information to the EDO, not specifically about ARPA allocations, but more like, how am I doing? What are the biggest needs that I have as a business owner as we're emerging from this pandemic? And using that information, then that would inform, well, how could we use these dollars to the best effect? So there's notionally how much money is required. We've put in here 1.5 million. I think some of the EDA might advocate for more. Others might advocate for less. So we've just put in a placeholder of $1.5 million here. We do not have a concrete plan behind that yet.
Yeah, I think it's just another thing when we look at it in the context of the budget conversation overall. I mean, and not to beat on the B-poll tax too much, but it's one of those areas where if we're looking to help stimulate economic activity and help businesses, as opposed to the grants or kind of the loosely structured aspect of the $1.5 million, maybe it's a conversation we have about lowering the overall tax burden, which is going to help support their business to begin with. So just another way that we can pull
And
those
if I
strings.
could add to that, they have been looking at what they did before and other things, and looking at data, because this is one area we have to show the economic impact and the disproportionately impacted communities, so it's not just a blanket. One of the things in the staff report, which we didn't highlight tonight, spoke about the state's allocation of their rescue funds, as well as all the other ARPA money that's coming in. The one thing I would like to highlight is the state has put money into tourism, which would be tourism related to hospitality on our hotels, as well as more traditional tourism. And so that one we're actually looking really closely at, as well as some of the others like rental assistance through the state instead of our local funds, to try to access those grant dollars. So that's one thing the EDO is looking at, because it might be we can use the state money for the hotels and the hospitality instead of that being part of this business
I see.
assistance.
Okay. Yeah, I think your point about data on what's benefited, what's going to help the business community would certainly be helpful before talking about allocating, $1.5 million there, especially if we've got other levers that we can pull. Under the strike fund for fiscal year 2023, that $1 million that ties into that Amazon grant, is that strike fund something that could be filled with money from cash in lieu for some of the other projects that have been approved, as opposed to allocating $1 million through ARPA?
Potentially could be, depending on the timing. The challenge with that is the cash in lieu is a voluntary concession and the nexus to the project development, and if legally we can move it to Virginia Village.
So your thing about it actually is payments to a property owner in order to subsidize affordable housing?
No. So my understanding is, so this affordable housing program, the $1 million for the strike fund, that's $1 million that we're putting in for a potential acquisition in Virginia Village in the future. That's what we're talking about?
Yeah, paralleling the model that we
Yeah,
put in
it's-
for the Amazon grant.
Okay. So what I'm saying is if we have a cash in lieu provision, whether it's for a Broad in Washington or it's for a Founders Row, could that money be used to fund this strike fund whenever we actually need to fund that, or allocate money to that funding, as opposed to taking $1 million of ARPA and parking it for something that may or may not happen? That's my point.
So I think the answer to that question is yes.
Okay.
That could be done.
Okay. I'm just trying to look at the big numbers and areas that give us flexibility, because I think, as Councilman Snyder pointed out, things can get very political very fast. And so if we're able to solve for some of these bigger numbers to create that flexibility and reconcile this, I think that would be helpful. Final question, the premium pay, general government employees. I just want to make sure through all of the descriptions that you guys gave about who's eligible and who's not, does that include DPW? If we're talking about essential, we're talking about having to deal with people face to face. Is DPW included in this category?
So DPW operations would be, and I think that's probably who you're referring to. So yes.
Talking about the folks like actually out in the community.
Yes,
Yes.
a lot of the operations, those are clearly meet the two tests. A lot of the engineers who are out in the field, same for CPEs who are doing on-site inspections for building safety and so forth. So to make sure we can survive a future audit, we're actually going position by position. and verifying each one. And then to the earlier point in Mr. Shields' effort, there'll be an equity bonus for all, tiered or whatever. So ARPA just becomes a funding source to help pay for that, for the targeted ones that
And law
are
enforcement was
eligible.
included in that as well?
Law enforcement, yes. Sheriffs, yes.
Okay.
Aurora House residential counselors, for example, would be. So we are doing a deep dive.
Okay. Just generally speaking, I know I've said this many times. I mean, I am an advocate for us using this money to invest in things that are going to have long-term impact, things, capital projects that the city is going to benefit from years to come. So as much as we can concentrate there, I am certainly in support of pedestrian safety, the stormwater, certainly the parks and improvements. Those things I think are critical for the city and would be smart investments on our part. So thank you.
All right, thank you. Vice Mayor Connolly?
Okay. Just a couple questions and thoughts. One on the stormwater. When we first got the reports of how much that stormwater was going to cost, it was eye-popping. And we fearlessly said, no, go ahead and let's start planning. We're going to figure out a way to pay for it. So now we figured out a way to pay for half of it, and I'm certain that we can figure out a way to do the rest as well. But I think that stepping forward and saying this is what is needed, and we are going to figure out a way to do this, is what needs to happen right there. If I'm looking at just one question on the parks, and that's a lot of projects to do in parks. Do we have the staff to do all this? Is there staffing that's included in here? And I know when we allocated the $1 million, we had a long conversation about staffing. Is the staffing included in this, or is the staffing included in the operating budget to help get all this done?
For the specific projects that are project management, we can include that staff time in these costs, and we have. And this, we've been coordinating with Public Works and the rest of the projects to try to time it, because it is a lot of staff work, for sure. So that's why it's also, this one shows it all summarized, but why also we're doing a bit of if I get to the right screen, but anyway, spreading it out over multiple years.
But would we be hiring staff with this one-time money to take care of this one-time money? I know there's a $320,000 allocation later for administrative.
Yeah, those administrative is really just for grant, auditing, procurement,
Right.
contracting. This could be using temporary staff we have now as they finish a project, and the charge to it most likely be similar to what we're doing there, is hiring temps to work the project as an owner's rep, and they don't have a long-term employment commitment with the city when these funding is gone.
Okay, some of these people, since we seem to be having so much trouble hiring people, we might want to look at some of these people and give them a long-term contract if they want it. Outside of this whole thing, if we have people like that. So that's another question. And then my last statement really has to do with the sidewalks. I agree with Letty and Debbie and Dave, everyone else who said, yes, we need to focus on sidewalks and crosswalks. And I'm just wondering, could some of the sidewalks and crosswalks be placed in services to disproportionately impacted communities if we are putting sidewalks in those communities? So it comes out of the infrastructure bucket or revenue replacement bucket and into the services to communities. Or if a sidewalk is a economic development thing, can it go into the negative economic impacts?
We are definitely exploring all opportunities, and I really don't like being the wet blanket, but it seems like on the federal regs I have to be. When they're looking at the impact for economic loss or disproportionately impacted, they are looking more like at census tracts, the HUD definition of qualified census tract, where you've got 25% more low income, that kind of threshold. So we've been able to look at that for like Virginia Village. We can get there on affordable housing because you just can't use this for affordable housing. I feel like we can document that. We've got Winter Hill, we got the Fields, we got Virginia Village. We can do that. If you're looking at a sidewalks segment in just one neighborhood, that's much harder to achieve. We're having to do that in the businesses, and we do have areas of our business that are very small income. We're targeting the Tinner Hill community, the Hillwood, diversity of businesses, or Eden, we can do it. But so we're continuing to look at that, but I haven't been able to find a very comfortable way to audit and put it into other categories. So when we were able to figure out a revenue loss calculation, that was one way for sure we can do pedestrian safety.
So thank you for continuing to look at it, and thank you for protecting us and looking at it super carefully.
Well, and unfortunately, it's really important because if you have a finding on your single audit, you put all your other federal money and grants at risk. So we
All
will
right.
continue to work it.
Mr. Duncan, did you have your hand up?
Yes, thanks. Just one quick question. Boss, maybe the hazard duty pay. I hear an echo. Me or somebody else. Duty pay include the offices that remained open, seeing the public during the at least the early stages of of City Hall reopening. Treasurer and Commissioner of Revenue.
We're still having a bit of an internal discussion about that, so we don't have the final answer on that. As was noted earlier, however, we do have some premium pay on the year-end dollars as well, and so if it can't be covered by ARPA, we would advocate covering it with the local dollars.
Okay, thanks.
All right, so I've got a few comments, most of which have been covered before, but I would like to see more of the stormwater covered if we can, and whether that means maybe even altering the project in some way to have additional quality component as well. But I think it's a missed opportunity if we can't find a way to get more, if not all, of that cost included here. I would also suggest we focus even more, if we're able to, on infrastructure, long-term infrastructure for our community. I do think that this, I don't know if you call it chart or whatever it is, has almost got too much granularity for going out to the public. I mean, to my mind, this is sort of something like a big picture that you're going to seek input on, not necessarily is 18,000 the right number, or should it be 22,000? I think it almost implies more precision than we have at this time. For example, like the economic development side of this, the 1.5 million, it sounds like there really isn't a proposal right now. And so to my mind, how much we would allocate to that would be dependent on what actually the proposal is, not we're going to spend this much money kind of come hell or high water. I think to my mind, we would balance that on, well, how is that money going to be spent and how would that benefit our community better than some other way of spending it? So I do think that this, I appreciate the precision on one level, but I think in other levels, in terms of soliciting input, is almost maybe too precise, and particularly if it's a couple million over, I think that's also an issue that's been raised by some of my colleagues. I think with the mental health professional, it sounds like that's a limited term person, right? Is that the schools would get it for 3 years or 4 years? So what happens at the end of that? Are they aware that they're going to either have to absorb that cost internally or kind of jettison the person?
Yes, they are.
Okay. Because I can just see that 3 or 4 years from now, I would imagine.
I
they probably
mean,
would
it's almost certainly to be a discussion at that point, but they're aware that this is going to run out.
Okay. And again, I would just echo the notion of trying to get as much pedestrian improvements, traffic calming improvements, and improvements of a similar nature to the extent we're able to, as many of my colleagues have suggested, finding various creative ways to try to make sure they meet the rules at the same time we're able to deliver those benefits to our community. So anyway, that's all I've got. Does anyone else have any final words? Or we can either take a break, a short 5-minute break. I've got a head nod. I've got a question, but let's go ahead and do a 5-minute break, okay? I know the last item shouldn't take very long, but let's go ahead and break till 10 o'clock and then hopefully bang the rest of this out fairly quickly. So 5-minute recess if we can. It is 10 o'clock, and we are back, reconvened, and ready to finish our agenda. And the last
Mayor,
item.
if you could just give me a moment to make sure we're good on the TV crew, please. Okay, thank you, Mayor. We're good.
All right, let's move on to the last item, which is the charter amendment regarding the requirements for appointment to boards and commissions. Mr. Shields?
Thank you, Council. And so this item is just a review at work session of a proposed action by Council to ask our General Assembly delegation to put in a bill to amend the city charter. And that charter amendment is shown up on the screen, but it would strike the requirement of a board and commission member to be a eligible voter of the city and just strike that requirement, so that the effect of it is that any resident of the city could be appointed to a board and commission. We have also noted that we would recommend putting in language that would say an 18-year-old minimum standard for appointment to boards and commissions. That was implicit in the eligible voter of the city, and now we would make that be part of the qualification as well. We do have wonderful student participants in our boards and commissions, but they are typically not formally voting members of those boards and commissions, but they are participants in it and valued contributors to those boards and commissions. So that's the request, and if Council takes action on this, then the next step would be to take it to Senator Saslaw and to Delegate Simon. They're aware that the Council is considering this, so they've put a hold on a bill that they could submit in to amend the city's charter.
All right, thank you very much. Comments, questions about this proposal? Ms. Hardy?
Just a quick one. I know this is something that the Housing Commission has requested, as well as a few other boards, and so I wholeheartedly support it, and hopefully our representatives will be carrying this bill for us. Thank you.
All right, other comments or questions?
I have a question.
Mr. Lichtenhouse.
Oh, sorry, David.
Then Mr. Snyder.
Does, when we say reside in the city, does that mean primary residence? Does that mean just owning a piece of real estate in the city? How do we qualify? I mean, obviously we go through appointments, folks put an address and we generally talk to them, but like what is the legal requirement for residing in the city?
So that's an interesting question, because to be an eligible voter of the city, that means your primary residence is in the city. So that is the way I think we would interpret that. If you're a resident of the city, it means that this is your primary residence. But I think it's a good question, and I'm not positive we thoroughly thought that through in terms of primary residence or secondary residence.
So the way that this works right now is if you're 18 and you can show you have an address in the city, whether you're qualified to vote or not, you can serve on a board or commission?
Yeah, I think that the test would be, do you have an address in the city? That is your residence. I mean, I think that is the point for most boards and commissions. Now, whether there's, the EDA, whether it would be a residency requirement, it might be something you might think about. But right now, it's written as a residency requirement, and we would interpret that as your primary residence.
Because you couldn't get qualified to vote here. Well, you have to choose one.
Yes.
Right? That's where your
and that has
primary
to be your
residence
primary.
is. So
Yeah.
conceivably, we could have folks that own a piece of real estate or 18, but don't technically live in the city that would apply and could serve on a board or commission. That's the way that this would read now.
So again, I'm not sure we totally thought about primary residence or secondary residence. In your conversation with Carol, Cindy, did that ever come up? So I think you're raising.
We can, wrong mic on, old habits. We can follow up with the city attorney. We talked about residency in terms of it conceptually being primary, but we didn't get down to that level.
Yeah. I mean, I understand the reason that we wanted to do this, because there are folks that live here that can't qualify to vote. But when you take that away and we don't specify what residing in the city means, it sets us up for unintended consequences, which I frankly would rather us not set up. So again, I understand the spirit of why we're doing this, but I want to make sure that if folks are serving on boards or commissions and they are residing within the city limits, it's their primary place of residence if we're not requiring them to be voters. So that would be my only request to clarify before actually approving this.
All right, why don't y'all reach out to the city attorney and seek guidance. Mr. Snyder, do you have a comment? Anyone down this end? Okay. All right, listen, thank you very much for doing this on this topic. And let's move on now to, looks like there's a future consent item. Did you want to mention that, Mr. Shields?
Yes, Carol McCoskey has prepared this at the request of the Appointments Committee, and this would be an amendment to the Community Development Authority bylaws to allow for the resident appointee to the CDA to have an alternate. And so that's what's before the City Council. I will say kind of my recommendation on this would be to keep it as was originally contemplated and just simply have the appointment of the resident member and not have an alternate. Alternates can cause confusion and something that just is a little bit of an additional thing to manage. However, the city attorney has prepared this, so if the council wishes to proceed with it, this would be the vehicle to do so.
Questions, comments about this item? Ms. Hardy?
Yeah, just as additional context from, so putting aside the fact that we had 2 qualified and enthusiastic applicants, I think when the appointments discussed it, we thought it was just beneficial to have greater citizen involvement on this important board. And so I think the compromise solution was kind of adding an alternate where that alternate would only serve as an alternate for the other resident member. So hopefully that minimizes the work for staff or any confusion. But Mary Beth or Ross can chime in too, as other members of appointments.
Yeah, I think initially I was actually just in support of expanding the EDA to add another resident to it because I felt that it didn't have enough resident participation. But I guess where we ended up was alternate as opposed to just adding one. Maybe think that was the easiest path. But again, just looking at the makeup, felt that we were underrepresented from a citizen perspective.
So, but Ms. Hardy mentioned this is the alternate for the resident. Is it actually written that way? Typically, like the language in a body would just say the alternate, not necessarily for a particular one of the representatives.
Carol told us that it had to be the way the bylaws were written. It was only the alternate for the other resident member and can't be an alternate for anyone else who might be absent.
Okay. All right, any other questions, comments? All right, why don't we move on to council schedule and request and other comments? Anyone have anything? Mr. Snyder?
I had one question, and I understand that at the mayor's meeting, the decision was to keep on the agenda the One City Center project. My question is, have we heard anything new on their affordable housing commitments, or are we going to have this same proposal in front of us with the 6%? Does anybody have any idea at this point? Wyatt, any negotiations that you've heard of?
There has not been a change offered by the developer to that as of tonight.
Okay.
So actually, could I just go back to the last item for a second? In reading it, it says, the city council may at sole discretion appoint an alternate board member for each regular member of the authority board. So does that implies to me that there may be an alternate for each? So there's 7 alternates or however many people, 5 alternates?
We're not appointing them is I think the plan. Carol said that the structure of the CDA was such that you could do that, and so it wouldn't require as extensive of a change as what the language that's in there right now. So all we're proposing is just adding the alternate for the additional resident member.
Okay. All right. I'll trust you all. Sometimes I can't help myself looking at legal documents or corporate documents. How about other comments that we have from folks?
Just let me follow up. So I really hope that the developer will give us more affordable housing units before next week. Let me just state that for the record. Also, I've contacted the Transportation Planning Board and NVTC Metro Committee for presentations by Metro on the derailment and the service reductions, and was told that it's under NTSB investigation and that WMATA can't speak to anyone about it. So I want folks to know I'm on this and I'm going to stay on it. Thanks.
All right, thank you. Ms. Hardy?
Wyatt, could we extend that invite to Kettler to join us, preferably early November? I want to make sure that the invitation's out there as a forcing mechanism to make sure that they are following up on all those resident concerns.
Yes, we are doing that, and we are scheduling that date. So I'll get back with council on when that will be, and we do want it to be with soon.
Great, thank you.
And so what is their posture, the developer's posture, the owner's posture on this?
So far, I think it's been, maybe, let me just follow up a little bit offline. I'm not sure I want to characterize it.
All right, and Mr. Duncan has a comment as well. Don't forget about him. Yes, Mr. Lichtenhouse.
Yeah, safe routes to schools. I think there have been some email exchanges about front-loading some of the expenses from the grant money we were receiving for the work around Haycock and Broad. We were able to do some of those pedestrian safety improvements on the front end to help facilitate safer walking to and from the schools now that we're open over there. Wyatt, is there anything else to report, or you guys still working on that?
So the question's been raised, and it might take a little bit of time before we get an answer back on that. And but it is, I think, a very good question, and we'll pursue it.
Okay.
Mr. Duncan?
I just wanted to confirm the Old Town, the Wednesday afternoon at 3 o'clock is still planned for a walking tour of the Founders Road 2 site. Folks are supposed to meet at the Dead Rite Aid, 3 to 4:30, sponsored by the applicant. That's what I read. Is that still on as far as folks know?
Get that information out to council, and I don't have it at my fingertips.
Okay. All right. I'm hoping to be back by then. And also, I think they had a virtual town hall scheduled for the next night at, not sure of the time. And I just wanted to thank the Transportation Committee, CACT, on the way down to Tennessee on Thursday. I was able to tune into their meeting. Was it Wednesday or Thursday? I forget. Wednesday, I guess it was. Their meeting where they did an extremely deep dive, as only our boards and commissions can do, into the Founders Road 2 application. It was really interesting, and very impressed with their attention to detail, and just wanted to thank them for that. And if anybody ever has a chance to listen to the recording of the meeting, our concerns, the concerns that were expressed in council were all aired and explored in great detail. So thanks to the CACT for their work. Thanks.
All right, Vice Mayor Connolly?
Thanks. October 26th, the Government Operations Committee meeting, we are going to take up Art in the Chambers, the city's public art policy. So if anyone would like to join us for that, that'll be at noon on the 26th. Mr. Shields, there are a few things as I'm looking at this schedule that were listed for tonight that didn't happen, and I'm wondering what the schedule is for them. There's the 405 Van Buren deed. There's the ADU policy, and then the contract to Ardent for South Maple. Are they scheduled for later?
So let me take each one in turn. So the ADU policy, I am working with staff to see if we couldn't, because we don't have a work session on November 1st, to see if we couldn't have at least a briefing to council on the issues at your next meeting on the 25th. So that's the status of that.
Okay.
If we're successful in that, then council might be able to have consideration of that action at your meeting on November 8th. The Maple intersection item, I know the staff report was not completed because of the some issues with the bid document. So is that push out a whole cycle, or is the desire still to have that on the 25th? Do you know, Ms. Messer?
It'll need to be pushed out. We're working with VDOT on the requirements for Title VI and small businesses, so I anticipate by the time we work through that, it'll be a November meeting.
So that'll-
hopefully not too far, because we're ready to move that CIP project forward.
And 405 Van Buren, we are in contact with the applicant. I think there's a meeting tomorrow where a couple things will be clarified, and we'll be able to schedule after that meeting, I think.
Great, thank you. And then two more questions. Today I was on Great Falls crossing the W&OD bike trail, and it looked like there was someone ripping up the connection to the street. Is that beginning? Or is that something completely different?
What that is the Park Authority kind of in their contract with their vendor, I think there was some damage to those aprons, so they're requiring their contractor to fix them. They're fully aware that we plan to go in there and change it completely. But nonetheless, they're doing that work kind of as part of their contract.
Okay.
So I did get some other calls on that, and that's what was confirmed to me this afternoon.
Okay.
Are they keeping them narrow, though, or are they going to keep?
They're basically just replacing exactly
just
what's
fixing
there.
the road.
It's a little odd.
Yep.
It's kind of but anyway, that's what's happening.
So that is inaccessible at this point
Well,
for bike. They have
that's
to go
right.
around it, I guess.
We're trying to find out exactly what the schedule is, but I hope that will not be the case for very long.
I mean,
Okay.
they poured 2 of them today.
Oh, okay.
And I think they'll be dry tomorrow,
Oh.
frankly. And then the last one, they were jackhammering this afternoon.
Yeah.
So, anyway,
So it's quick, but useless.
yeah.
And then my last question is just, I have had some communication with the resident and with Zach Bradley and you regarding debris on Washington Street that goes from Marshall Street and Falls Church all the way out to Gallows Road. And it just seems like the kind of thing that regionally we should be making sure that there's not so much debris from construction projects. But neither the resident nor I had any idea how to do that regionally. Who caused the problem and who should clean it up?
So I think we're going to clean up what's in the city.
Yeah, that's what Zach said.
We
That's
have a
really
street
good.
sweeping contract.
Yeah.
I don't know the rest of it. Usually what it is, it's some dump truck that isn't properly closed up and they're leaking gravel out the back.
Yeah, no, this was like scraping of something, like the
Oh, like
top
they had actually
layer
done
of the
some work.
road, like there was a vendor who did it
And then
and
didn't
just
clean
left
up.
debris and hasn't come back and finished the project.
I beg your pardon. Okay. Well, so for VDOT, that's a contract performance issue.
Right. So hopefully Zach will be,
Yes.
can we get to VDOT?
Yeah, we have our contacts
Okay.
with VDOT, so I think he has already relayed that complaint, and so we'll see if we can get some action.
Okay, thank you.
Any other comments, or are we ready to adjourn? All right, I'll take that as ready to adjourn. All right, good evening, everyone. Thank you. We'll see each other very soon.
Good evening. Thanks, everybody.
I'm sorry, Phil, did you have another, I saw your hand up. Was that from earlier? Or did you have?
No,
another-
just taking it.
All right,
No, just one.
all right, have a
Good night.
have a good trip back.
All right, thanks. Bye.
Good night.